Mr. Howard Hill.
Mr. Howard Hills.
How are you doing, sir?
Howard, how are you doing?
Good morning. I'm not a very technically sophisticated end user here, but I think we've made a connection.
Thank you. We're not very accomplished either. This is a new podcast for myself and Steve. And let me give you a little background so that you catch up with what we're doing. As you know, we know each other from our battles with the Puerto Rican Bar Association and the question of Puerto Rico. But as I now launch this year's 2026 version of the Puerto Rican Bar Association conference, I'm also doing a moot court competition along with that.
That's what I understand.
With that, and I'll share with you that information as well if you haven't seen it already. Well, we'll be talking about the United Nations resolutions 1951 about the Puerto Rico being sovereign, and then contrast that with the Supreme Court decision that Puerto Rico is not sovereign. So that's going to be more or less the question that's going to be litigated at the moot court. We have over 60 law schools that we've invited. Already schools are, and this is now for the fall semester, and we already have 4 schools committed. So it's going to be a lot of interest in this. But on top of that, I've also became a minister while you and I have not spoken of my church.
Are you prepared to take my confession?
So I do a podcast. I'm doing a podcast on Wednesdays that has to do with that crossroads, First Amendment, between separation of church and state and infringement, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm doing a podcast that's going to be concentrating on my expertise as both a lawyer, constitutionalist, and a minister. And on Tuesdays, we'll be doing this talk called Raw Talk. And that is just out there, pure politics about things that are happening locally and nationally as well. And Steve and I met over 20 years ago when we were doing both radio and Spanish language. And so, we enjoyed our interaction between each other. And that's why he invited me and I invited him to do these series of podcasts. So now we're just beginning and learning the process of this, what's going on with how these programs work. And I've had to, by the way, I retired as a lawyer. I'm no longer practicing so that I can do this, right? I can do this. But I want to be able to bring to our community the combined experiences of all these things I've done in my lifetime and now bring it out to a different platform. So this is what we're trying to do. And this is our second show, Howard. So welcome to what we're going. I hope that it wasn't our inability to get you the contact. And I have a young law student, Monica, who you have contact with.
I was just going to say, poor Monica. She's like my daughters. Whenever they see me with any kind of digital electric device in my hand, they grab it and say, "What are you trying to accomplish? What do you want to do?" And so poor Monica had to sit there and while we fumbled around. And so all I can do is ask for her forgiveness and forbearance.
So Steve, I know Howard for many years now, and I'm like, why don't you read? You got his bio there. Why don't you read his bio so the people who are listening to know who we are?
Well, apparently, Mr. Howard, nice meeting you, sir. It's been a pleasure. Maybe we'll meet together sometime.
Nice meeting you.
Thank you for being in the show. We really appreciate, and our doors are open for you as many times as you want to come. We talk. I have a little bit of information here about you and what you've done. And it's basically in your own words. It was I was able to find about your candidacy, the voters who elect you to a new school board member, which dedicates long records of support and education excellence to students and families in Laguna Public Schools. Okay.
Yes, I'm currently serving on the local school board here in Laguna Beach.
Wow, look at that. Look at that.
And I can tell you that if you follow what's going on in public education in Laguna Beach, California, across the nation, it's pretty much like trench warfare. It's really, really tough. I did an interview on the local radio station the other day and got a chance to actually sort out what's going on a little bit. But I don't know. In terms of my career and my life, most of my career in my life has been driven by the fact that when I got out of law school, I did something that my dad thought was really not very smart. I joined the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps sent me to Micronesia to write constitutions for these new governments that were being established out there. And that's when I got involved in the whole issue of political status, because I was supposed to write these constitutions for these places, and they sent me to an island that was very remote, but it was strategically located, and the United States needed to negotiate treaties with all of these islands, and so they needed the islands to have governments. And so they sent me out there to set up the governments, and that's when I first heard about the insular cases, because these islands were under a United Nations trusteeship. So it goes back, I'm really excited about this the program that you're going to have, where you're going to be talking about what went on in the UN and
the moot court, yeah.
Because all I'm saying is the moot court. I'm sorry. It's funny because I had in my head Model UN, because I support the Model UN program here at the high school. So I was thinking moot court, Model UN. But the point is that my experience with the issue of what was going on in the United Nations, in the post-war period, and the decolonization process under Article 73 of the Charter and all that, I got a crash course in that, because I had to help these islands put together constitutions. And then based on my Peace Corps experience, I ended up negotiating for the US the treaties that we did with those governments that I helped set up. So that's when I got a crash course on what happened in the United Nations, and then the what happened in the insular cases. And that takes you all the way back to the Northwest Ordinance and forward in terms of our constitutional system. But yes, after a career of working on and what happened is I got married out there on this very remote island, and so I call myself the ultimate colonialist, because I went to this island. They had a perfectly smoothly functioning theocracy. The Congregationalist Church ran the island. And I came there and I gave them secular government, and which of course messed everything up. And then I took the most beautiful woman and left. And so, but in seriousness, I joke that I've spent the remaining years of my life basically making sure that my wife's people are well taken care of in the decolonization process. So, and that led me to get involved in decolonization for all the U.S. territories, and so that sort of brings me around. And then in my retirement, I got called back into government in 2000. In 2000, I was down in North Carolina taking care of my grandkids, and I get a call from this Army colonel in the National Security Council at the White House, and he says, "Are you the Howard Hills that negotiated the free association treaties with the Pacific Islands in the late 70s, early 80s?" And I knew where this was headed, and I said, "No, I'm not that Howard Hills." And so they said, "Well, next Wednesday, you're giving a briefing to the new negotiating team that's been assembled, because we have to they lasted for 40 years. We have to renegotiate them and extend them for another 40 years. And so, cutting to the chase, I went up there and gave a big presentation to this big group of people, and they made me come back into government. So then I renegotiated the Compact of Free Association, and we got it approved in 2024. And so I came back to Laguna Beach to retire, hang out with my wife, do a little traveling, and they talked me into running for school board. And so that brings us full circle with you guys leaving with the school board. There are many days when I'm sitting through long meetings with people yelling at me, and I'm thinking, why did I run for a school board? But we're turning the corner, and we're going to turn it around, and we're going to do some good things for the students to restore the model of public education that we need in America.
Okay, Howard, that was just a great resume. And it's really great. Tomorrow, when I do the divine justice, I indicated to them in my role as a minister, I want to be able to talk about the First Amendment, and that schools and school boards and the curriculum. I'm going to be talking about tomorrow about how some of the transgender and LGBT curriculums I've been approved and disapproved. Case that went to the Supreme Court just the other day, indicating that you cannot force parents to have their children undertake this course, which I call tolerance. But apparently that tolerance is not something that can be forced upon others. But that you bring in at that crossroads is perfectly why lawyers play such an important role, because those questions that go before the school board, whether they should approve a book or not approve a book, whether you should approve a curriculum or not approve it, becomes a constitutional issue. It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, so Steve, I kind of stepped on your lines there. Tell me about you, because I don't know you. So, or what more do you want to know about me? Well,
I wanted to ask you, and we'll go into a little bit about me later on. But I wanted to ask you, now that Tony brought that subject, I want to piggyback on that. And since you are in the school board, what do you think of what's going on nowadays with governments? And I'm not going to point fingers here, because that's not what we're here for. We're here to make changes, to do it better. Those governments, local governments throughout the states that have taken books and trying to erase some of the history, okay, of our nation. Either they like it or not, it's part of our history, okay? And there's been here in Florida, may I just say, and because this is where I live, Mr. DeSantis has done what he's done with certain level of education, and taking history books out of the curriculum of the students in schools.
Well, it raises a lot of issues. I just did an interview here the other day, as I was mentioning, and the interviewer asked me kind of the same question that you just asked me. What's going on in our schools? Because it's a war zone, is what it is, and I think part of the answer is, and I actually want to get back to the point Tony was making, that Anthony was making. Do I call you Tony or Anthony?
Tony, call me Tony, please.
Okay. So the point I made is that right now what's happening in school board elections, and I think it's also true statewide and nationally, what happens now is when somebody wins an election, historically, you let the people that won the election, you let them go to work, you let them show what their agenda is and how they're going to try to implement it. And if you're in the opposition, you start looking at what they're doing, and you start getting ready for the next election and make a case that what they did wasn't as good as what you want to do. So you run for office or whatever. Now what happens in America, and what's happening particularly in school boards, because school boards are interesting. They're really the entry level to retail politics in America, and there's no qualifications to get on a school board, just like there's no qualification to get on a city council, and so you get a lot of people coming into the system that don't have any experience in government, and so what happens is what's happening now is when there's an election, you no longer give them a chance to show you what they can do and what they can't do. You just go in and you just disrupt the process of governance, and that's what is happening. And there's been movies that have made about it. There's movies about situations where you've got parents who have trans kids in the public schools, and they want their kids' rights to be recognized, and they want to expand their rights and whatnot. And then you've got people who are in opposition to that. Whether you call them MAGA or whether you call them right wing. So whether it's right wing or left wing, extremism or not extremism, what happens is whoever didn't win the election goes in and just disrupts the governance process. They don't allow you to have meetings. They'll come in with 50, 60 people into a meeting and just start screaming and yelling and heckling the members of the board. And you can't conduct an orderly meeting. And then what they do is they go out and say, look at these guys. They can't even run an orderly meeting, and so they disrupt, and then they blame the disruption. And this is not, I'm not sitting here saying this is my personal grievance. This is actually a playbook. It is in America, we've gotten to the point, particularly at the retail level, but also up the chain, where what you do is you disrupt the governance process, you disrupt government operations, and then you get control of communications, and then you politicize everything. And you don't give the people who won the election a chance to succeed or fail. You just go in and disrupt it. And that's what's happening. And there's documentaries that have been made about it. And what's funny, or not funny, but what's interesting is that it is both on the left and on the right. They both use the same playbook. And so that's what's going on in a lot of school districts. And so one of the things I want to do, going back to Tony's point about the Constitution and lawyers and whatnot, this being the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I try to use my position on the school board to get people back focused on, the American idea. And one of the things I would point out in the context of the moot court competition is that the American idea has really become the world idea, the global idea that's embodied in the UN Charter. And if you look at the UN Charter and you boil it all down to an essence, it's about self-determination. It's about the right of peoples to have self-determination, particularly Article 73 and the UN decolonization process. But where did that idea of self-determination come from? Well, it came first of all from the Atlantic Charter that Churchill and Roosevelt did right before World War II. But the Atlantic Charter self-determination concept came from what? The Declaration of Independence. The consent of the governed principle in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence said no government is just unless it's established by the consent of the people and the consent of the governed. And that idea was then put into the Northwest Ordinance, which was a mechanism for territories to achieve equality and to achieve government by consent. So what I like to do, and do it, I'm doing it on 4th of July, I've done it recently, is talk about how this thing called the Declaration of Independence and the principle, the American idea, which is now the world gold standard for democracy, is government by consent. Where did that come from? And the way I explain it is this. The world order that existed right before the American Revolution was one in which at the top of the recognized hierarchy, you had God. God was at the top, and then there was the king, and the king claimed to get his powers from God and the divine right of kings. And so then under the king came, the state, the government, the nobility, and you have this hierarchy. It goes down through the bourgeoisie and goes down to the tradespeople. But at the bottom of the hierarchy was the individual. The individual, whether it was a peasant or whether it was somebody who was in some manner, on somebody's estate, and had some kind of role. The bottom line is that the individual was at the bottom of the line. You either had to fit into that hierarchy or you were just stripped of any power or rights or anything, and you were just an individual. And being just an individual was the lowest status you could have. What Thomas Jefferson did in the Declaration of Independence is he turned that upside down. He took the individual and put the individual right up under God. So it was, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, it says God and then the individual. That's what the preamble of the Declaration says. It says the individual is endowed by the Creator with these rights, and they include the ability to then set up governments and through the consent of the governed. And so what Jefferson did was he made the individual the most important relationship is the relationship between the individual and God, and then those individuals collectively create governments, and the governments are just only if they have consent of the governed. So that's essentially the idea of self-determination that we have in the UN Charter that was put to the test in 1953, in September of 1953, when resolution, what is it, 742 and 748, or is it, or is it?
748, I think it is.
Yeah. So anyway, I think that, what's going on in the local public school is directly related to what's going on at the state level and at the national level. And it's all directly related to what went on in 1976 when the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah. So that's really, really a great resume, Howard. And again, an understanding of what this all means. There's so many complicated issues you brought up with the school board and the politics in general, which of course are battle topics. But I'd like to concentrate now on the issue of Puerto Rico and the territories. First, let's mention you wrote a book on this issue, and you have extensive experience, as you describe, writing the Constitution of the territories, and including your well understanding of the agreements that happened with Puerto Rico and the UN in 1953 when we took out Puerto Rico, the colonization. I wonder if you could explain to the people what that meant, what happened with the decolonization committee, and what representations the United States made to the UN.
Well, I guess one question I would have is, I don't want to say too much to the point where we sort of preempt the deliberations of the moot court competition process, because we sort of, I guess one of the purposes of the moot court is for the students to go find out that.
Yes.
Out.
Yes.
So
it is.
I don't want to say too much, but
Right.
But I do think that perhaps one way to help frame the issue is that after World War II, it's fascinating, a little bit of history that doesn't say too much or spill the beans too much, is that it's interesting that Germany was very powerful in the Pacific. It had a very strong colonial presence in the Pacific before World War I, and it went out, and there's the area that we're talking about when we talk about the U.S. Pacific is an area of ocean that basically runs in between Guam and Hawaii, and north of the equator. And when you talk about Micronesia and Palau and the Marshall Islands, which also includes the Guam and the Marianas, which is now a U.S. territory. This is an area of ocean with about 2,000 islands and at least 15 languages. And it covers an area of ocean larger than the continental United States. And yet the control of those islands is in the hands of the leaders of these very small little populations. And so what happened is Germany was out there, and in the reality, the geopolitical reality that the UN deals with in the Pacific is that Germany understood that if you control Oceania, basically the islands that run right down the middle of the Pacific from the North Pacific down into the South Pacific, if you can control key strategic islands in that, they call it the Blue Continent. It's water, and then it's got these little islands all through it. If you can control that, you can control 1/3 of the Earth's surface, and that's from the west coast of South America to India. You can and from Australia up to Alaska and Siberia. You can control that whole region, and so the Germans figured that out. And then what happened in World War I is the United States and Japan was our ally in World War I, with Britain fighting against Germany, and we defeated Germany. And what we did to reward Japan for emerging into the international world and taking a place in alliance with Great Britain and the United States, is we rewarded Japan by, when the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, when the League of Nations was established, even though the United States did not join the League of Nations because Wilson was unable to sell it to Congress, the League of Nations was established, and the United States supported and Britain supported, and we awarded Japan the League of Nations mandate over all those islands. And so Japan then emerged as an international power and controlled the Central Pacific under the League of Nations. Unfortunately, what Japan did is they decided to change their dance partner. And before World War II, while they were supposed to be providing civilian government under the League of Nations mandate, they in fact were secretly militarizing the islands, and they were getting ready to use the power of controlling the Central Pacific to become a dominant world power. And Micronesia was what they militarized. And so then they changed their dancing partner, and instead of being allied with Britain and the United States against Germany as they were in World War I, they aligned with Italy and Germany against the United States and Britain in World War II. And that's why they bombed Pearl Harbor. And so but what's interesting is, at the end of World War II, when the League of Nations was basically no longer viable, what did we do? We established a successor to the League of Nations, which is the United Nations. And I think for students that are going to be in the moot court competition, they might not have otherwise got that history, that the whole century was a lead up to creating that United Nations Charter. And the Atlantic Charter, which was done in August of '41, right before Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt and Churchill met on the ship out off the coast of Canada, and they, in the Atlantic Charter, they said they laid the foundation for what became the core of the UN Charter, which was again based on the core of the Declaration of Independence, the idea that the parties to the war, at the end of the war, that the United States and Britain agreed that they would not seek territorial aggrandizement as a result of the hostilities. In other words, that when the hostilities ended, so think about it, the United States wasn't even in the war yet. We had not declared war yet, but Roosevelt met with Churchill, and they agreed to these principles in the Atlantic Charter that said, when the war's over, we're going to restore the democratic governments, and we're going to restore the governments that existed, and we're going to restore the territorial integrity of countries that were invaded. And for those peoples that don't have governments, we're going to create for those people who either don't have governments or who were under colonial rule, in other words, were not being ruled by government by consent, that those peoples would be given the right of self-determination and to be able to choose the form of government under which they want to live. So that really is a little bit of history that students in the moot court competition, it kind of sets the stage for them to understand Article 73 and the decolonization process, which led to the trusteeship, which we had over Micronesia. And then what happened, going back to your point about Puerto Rico, is when the U.S. took over the trusteeship on behalf, they entered into a trusteeship agreement with the Security Council of the United Nations, and we governed from 46 to 86. We governed under the United Nations agreement that we had. But what the trusteeship agreement said is, it said the administering authority, the United States, can govern the trust territory in the same way it governs its domestic territories. Now, Tony, this is of essential importance because that kicked in the insular cases. Right. And that kicked in the whole tradition of what was the whole issue of what was then going on. So then, all of a sudden, in 19.
Let me hold you 1 second there to make sure that everyone's following. to make sure that back. So after World War II, before as we established the United Nations, there was no question that Puerto Rico was a colony and was governed by the United States under the Colonial Territorial Clause. No question as to that at all. Correct?
That's absolutely the case, and that what's going to be an interesting issue in the moot court competition, as you said, is what did the United States say to the what did the United States delegation to the UN say to the UN about the status that the existing territories of the United States had, and what would that portend for the status of the trust territory? In other words, it's not a coincidence that the trusteeship agreement, when it was negotiated, you had the State Department in there doing the negotiations through the UN, and you had the Interior Department, which had the only experience. One of the problems, the schizophrenia that the territories have to deal with, is that internationally, you have the State Department taking the lead for the U.S. on all UN affairs. But then domestically, when it comes to who actually has the money and who actually has the power within the executive branch and Congress, it was the Interior Committee, and it was the committees of Congress that managed the territories. And so the State Department is up in New York saying one thing to the UN, and the Interior Department is, in some cases, doing something different. And so the question is, what was communicated to the United Nations in 1953 about what Puerto Rico's status was going to be in relation to the Article 73, and at the same time that was going on, we were entering into an agreement with the UN that gave us the ability to treat the trust territory the same way we treated our domestic territories, which kicked in the same, in essence, colonial status that the U.S. domestic territories, including Puerto Rico, had at that time under the Insular Cases. So it was this merger of international law and domestic law, and it never got sorted out very well. And so the students that are going to be doing the moot court competition, they are entering into an area of elegant complexity. And so it's going to be very interesting to talk about what was communicated to the UN. I've talked to you about what was communicated in connection with the U.S. assuming power over the trusteeship territory, and the fact that somehow or another, the lawyers from the Justice Department, the lawyers from the Interior Department, lawyers from the State Department, somehow or another, they got the Security Council and the General Assembly to agree that we could govern the UN trust territory under the same law that we governed our domestic. That wasn't an accident that happened. That's because they had a fixed idea of when you have territory that's not fully, if you look at the Insular Cases, if you have territory that's not fully incorporated under the Constitution, and that the Constitution does not apply in other words, what we came to call incorporated territories. If you have a territory that's not that and is subject to the doctrine, the non-incorporation doctrine of the Insular Cases, then guess what? You can govern them, and the extent to which they have constitutional rights is discretionary. The Constitution doesn't apply automatically. So we, somehow or another, when it came to the trust territory, we preserved the non-incorporation doctrine, gave us plenary power without the limitations of the Constitution. And then you switch over to a few months, a couple of years later, and it's 1953, and you're going to the UN and saying Puerto Rico is no longer a colony, or Puerto Rico is something now called a free associated state, or
we have a bilateral compact as
Yeah,
the government of Puerto Rico, un compacto bilateral, right? This is what he was saying.
That's what Congress said in the statute.
Right.
And then what the UN was saying, what the U.S. was saying so we had Congress in the statute saying, in the nature of a compact, and then the State Department people take that up to the UN and they say it's an association. This association between the United States and they have a constitution now, and they've created this association, and of course that was in the context of them with a twist of a phrase calling it free association. And what is free association? Well, the answer is nobody said and nobody knew. And so then, but on the basis of this association, suddenly there were enough votes and enough abstentions to remove Puerto Rico from the UN, to take them out of the UN decolonization process. So at the same time we put Micronesia into the UN decolonization process, we took Puerto Rico out of the UN decolonization process based on something called an association, which it wasn't defined other than the fact that they had a constitution that had been passed by a Congress that amended the constitution and then approved it.
Steve, you got all that?
Yeah, actually I did. And the funny part about it is, okay, and it's not funny at all, es Estado Libre Asociado, state free but associate, a commonwealth, great business for the United States to capitalize because it has Puerto Rico under the yugo, okay, and the monies that Puerto Rico makes for the United States as a colony is great. It's a great business for the United States. So Howard, I wanted to ask you something. What motivated you to write that book? What influenced you to get so involved in what Puerto Rico 51 is?
Well, it's very interesting because there's an answer to the question, and then there's reflection on what it means. But very simply, after working on these issues for 40 years, I was talking to an old friend of mine on the beach, and he and I we can still catch waves on a stand-up paddleboard, but we can no longer we no longer can ride a wave from a prone position on a board because it takes us too long to get up on our feet.
You are not joking.
And so we sit on the beach and watch the young surfers do what we used to do, and so he was asking me the same question. He was saying, well, how'd you get all involved in this stuff about Puerto Rico and the territories and Guam and all this, and what's the problem? And so I started trying to describe to him, the insular cases, and he kept asking me, okay, but so what? So they're down in Puerto Rico and they're U.S. citizens and they have limited rights there, and then they come to the States and they have full rights, and you're talking about Justice Taft, the Chief Justice, writing the Balzac decision and saying that even though we've given them citizenship, that doesn't mean anything. If they want citizenship, they can move to a state. If they want full, so that's, and I'm trying to explain, that's like requiring people to, that's requiring dislocation of people from their homeland in order to get equal rights. And, we don't do that in the United States. And he kept pressing me and getting me to really boil it down. He said, so what is I said, well, the problem is that they're citizens, but they don't have a state. Because if you're in the U.S., if you're a citizen and you're not in a state, then you can never have equality. Citizenship can never be translated into freedom and liberty unless you have equal rights. And that's one of the problems with the whole issue of having people in the country who are not in the country legally. And I don't want to get into immigration debate, but the point is, our government system doesn't work when it applies to people that don't have equal rights. We're not meant to govern people that are in a class, a subclass. And, there's a great book that was written in 1947 by a guy named F.A. Hayek called The Road to Serfdom. Yeah. And if I was the king of the world, I would say you can't graduate from a high school in the United States unless you've had a professional educator read and explain the F.A. Hayek's book, Road to Serfdom. You know, it should be required reading for everyone. I'm joking, but I'm making the point that. But the point is, we don't want serfdom in America. We don't want a subclass. We don't want a cheap labor class. We don't want a situation where we have millions and millions of people in our country. So either you have to give, and I'm not trying to, by saying this, I'm not trying to get involved in the politics of the immigration debate. I'm really not addressing that. What I'm addressing is, if we're going to have people in our country and we're going to govern them, they have to either be citizens or they have to have a pathway to citizenship. And right now, the pathway to citizenship is through, naturalization under our laws. And so, but a subset of that, before the whole immigration, issue began that we're dealing with right now, we had people in our territories who we gave citizenship to. And in some cases, that led to equality through statehood. But in some cases, it leveled off, and there was a state of arrest in the process of political status resolution. There was a state of arrest that happened. And all of a sudden you had, because of the Balzac ruling, you had a situation where people could be citizens and have no pathway to equality. And that's where we first separated citizenship from the Constitution, is when we said, everybody wants to blame it on the court. Everybody wants to blame it on, the Downs v. Bidwell ruling. But if you think about it, Downs v. Bidwell, all it said was, we don't know what the courts basically said, we don't know what these people are. At that time, New York had, I think 8 million people in it. And the Philippines had 7.8 million people in it. So suddenly the court's sitting there, and you get this treaty that the president has signed that has Article 9 in it that says we haven't yet figured out what the status of these people is going to be. That's why Article 9, it says Congress shall determine the political status and civil rights of the inhabitants of these territories, which included 8 million or almost 8 million, 9 million people in the Philippines, and then the population of Guam and the population of Puerto Rico. So the court gets this treaty that says we're now sovereign, but it doesn't say what the status of the people is. So the court looks at that and they go, well, geez, it's not the court's job under the Uniform Naturalization clause in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4. Congress has the authority to decide who's citizens and who's not citizens. And under Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, Congress has control of territories. And so since Congress has control of territories and citizenship, we're just the court. We don't know how to interpret Article 9 of this treaty, and it's not our job. And so they did Downs v. Bidwell. And you can talk about racism, and there was, when people say that the insert cases were racist, what I say is, yes, there was a racist assumptions underlying the insert cases, but I remind people that anybody that took an oath of office to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States in 1901 was by definition a racist, because at that time racism was legal in the United States. So if you took an oath of office to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States in 1901, you were a racist, even if you individually did not harbor racial attitude or white superiority or white supremacy.
Let me jump in here 1 second and amplify, because I think you make some very important points. Because people might be saying, why do you care, Tony and Steve? I'm still talking about Puerto Rico. because in essence, what you have pointed out is that this is really contra to the spirit of the Constitution, contra to the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, contra to the Atlantic Charter, contra to hold people in a state of limbo where there are citizens but don't have the rights that all citizens do. And that is a problem for America, not just for Puerto Ricans. We have an incongruent position when it comes to certain millions of Americans, and of course our interest, Puerto Rican Bar Association, is with Puerto Rico, which then gets to the question, Howard, of why we're doing this moot court. And I like, I point out to people is that Puerto Rico could have 100 plebiscites and 100% of the people vote for statehood, or 100% vote for independence. So what? They cannot affect the status of Puerto Rico until Congress decides to affect the future of Puerto Rico. That's why we do not support, none of the bar associations support either statehood or independence or some free associated state or some other combination. No one supports a particular support. We do not stand for any particular status, but we do stand for giving Puerto Rico the opportunity to make a decision, because they cannot do it on themselves. And moot court is directed at creating a cadre of Howard Hills around the country who knows something about this, because you and I know that in the law schools, they teach you nothing about the territorial clause. They teach you nothing about this history that you have just so clearly put forward. No one knows. So if we have a cadre, perhaps in the future, when a bill like Darren Soto's bill gets before Congress, maybe it has a chance of passing.
Well, I would like to respond to that, Tony, by saying that please, I don't want anyone to misunderstand me about this. And it is that I just affirmed very clearly that there was racism institutionalized at the time the insert cases were done. But what happened next is a bigger problem. And it is that when the insert cases were reported, I would have thought that Congress would say, oh, the court isn't going to decide what we're going to do. The court has balked, to use a baseball term. The court has decided they're not going to play this game, and they've created this thing called, unincorporated territory. And so we, Congress, since we have responsibility for citizenship and we have responsibility for the territories, we're now going to have to decide what we're going to do. And instead, what Congress has done ever since the insert cases were handed down is they've taken the insert cases to mean that they don't have to do anything. The Congress has interpreted the insert cases to mean that the court's not requiring Congress to do anything. The court's just accepting that they are what they are, which is unincorporated territories. And then we've legislated. Sometimes we've had enlightened legislation towards the territories. Sometimes we've had very unenlightened legislation towards the territories. But the point is, the status and the rights of the people exist at the discretion of Congress, because Congress has interpreted the insular cases to mean that Congress doesn't have to do anything. And so the courts say, we're not going to decide it because the president and Congress have not made it clear what their status is. So we're not going to define their status. And the president's, but more so the Congress, because presidents can't really, ultimately can't really decide status. Congress more particularly has said, well, the court's saying that it's, that we don't have to do anything. And that's why it's of great significance. And, I think this discussion we're having right now, without getting too far into the actual UN issues, right, so that we don't preempt
scales.
I don't want to become the guy that did what do you when you're in law school and you have those abbreviated notes before you.
We have the bench memo. We don't want to give. We don't want to give them the bench memo.
But this is a very significant point, and it is this. In 2016, when Associate Justice Elena Kagan wrote the opinion for the court in the Puerto Rico v. Sanchez Valle case. And she goes through this whole discussion of the history of consular cases and the status and whatnot. And at the end, she says, look, you have this current status, which is very convoluted and complicated and doesn't really satisfy a lot of your concerns. But if you want to resolve your status, don't come to the court. Justice Kagan, at the end of that opinion, she says, if you want to find the pathway to resolution of your status, that leads to the steps of the U.S. Congress. And so one way of looking at that is to say that the court created the problem in 1901 with the Downs v. Bidwell case, and then it made matters worse in 1922 in the Balzac case when it said, see, in 1901 they could say, well, we're not going to really say what your status is and what rights you have because Congress hasn't defined your whether you're citizens or not. And so then it gets to 1922, and all of a sudden Justice Taft says, well, the fact that they gave you citizenship doesn't determine your rights and your status. So that's what Balzac stands for, is that you can govern a territory in which there's citizenship has been granted the same way you governed a territory in which citizenship had not been granted. And that's what the Balzac case stands for. And that creates the limbo that Puerto Rico's in today. But what's really significant is, one way to look at it is the president and Congress screwed up by passing the treaty, Article 9 of which did not really say what the status was. And then the court decided not to solve the problem by judicial edict. And you can argue about whether that was because of racism or it was because Congress, the president, because in the Foraker Act, so first you have the treaty, Article 9, then you have the Foraker Act in 1900, and that doesn't say what their status is. It just says they're citizens of the territory, but it didn't give them a national citizenship. And so the treaty, Article 9, and the Foraker Act both failed to define the rights and status of the people. So then the court says, well, we're not going to do it because it's not our job. And so then Congress and then Balzac comes along and says, even if you give them citizenship, so they're just like Hawaii and Alaska and Oklahoma and Arizona and all the 32 territories that became states, even though you gave them citizenship like that, Taft ruled in 1922 that even giving them citizenship doesn't define their rights under the Constitution. So now you get Justice Kagan. So it's kind of like you say, well, the court created the problem, and now the court's saying that Congress has to solve the problem that the court created. But it really wasn't just the court in the insular cases that created the problem. It was the combination of the president in the treaty, the Congress in the Foraker Act, and the courts in the insular cases in Downs v. Bidwell. And then in 1922, even when citizenship was granted, it was all of them. It was the president, it was the courts, it was Congress, and it was the courts. And they've all created this limbo status. And the last thing I'll say about it is when racism, when legal racism was ended under the Civil Rights Act of 1965. So at that point, what happened? Well, at that point, the insular cases were confirmed by the Supreme Court after the Brown versus Board of Education. After Brown versus Board of Education said that racism, legal racism, segregation, the schools and whatnot, is unconstitutional. In 1957, that was in 54. In 57, the Supreme Court handed down its first insular case ruling after Brown versus Board of Education, and that was the Reed v. Covert decision. And in Reed v. Covert, they said, we don't want to expand the insular cases any farther than they are, but they do stand for the proposition that under the territorial clause, Congress can govern these territories that have not yet been incorporated into the Constitution. And one of the members of the Supreme Court who signed on to that decision was Thurgood Marshall, the first black member of the Supreme Court. So, the issue of racism was alive in 1901. It was alive in 1954, and it's still alive today. Racism still plays a role in our national, our struggle of national character. But the point is, if you just talk about the insular cases as racist, you're missing a big part of the story, because a big part of the story is that there were actually some reasons why the Supreme Court in 1901 didn't declare that. In other words, if you look at what they did in 1905, they declared, one thing that people, when they think of the insular cases, they only think of the cases that decided that they were unincorporated territories. At the same time, in 1905, they looked at the situation in Alaska and they declared that they were incorporated. And that was one of the insular cases. They always say, oh, the insular cases were decided by the same court that decided Plessy v. Ferguson. And so it was just racism, race. Well, that same court that decided Plessy v. Ferguson and Downs v. Bidwell also decided Rasmussen versus the United States in 1905, in which they said, no, it's pretty clear that the treaty with the Russians, under which we acquired Alaska in 1867, that treaty intended for them to be U.S. citizens. And on that basis, we're going to treat the Constitution as applying to the territory of Alaska. They're incorporated. And what's really interesting, if you want to have a constitutional discussion about this, is I think you can argue that the Balzac decision that held that even though they got citizenship, they are not incorporated and can be governed the same way as non-citizens under the insular cases, that's in conflict with the 1905 decision on Alaska. Because Alaska, in 1905, they said, well, it's pretty clear that the treaty intended them to be citizens, so the Constitution applies. So then in 1922, Justice Taft, who had been the governor of the Philippines when it was a territory, and Governor Taft, who I don't think he particularly liked territories, he rules that citizenship doesn't matter, that just merely, the way he put it is, merely conferring citizenship, we cannot infer from that, and so all of a sudden citizenship. But if you look at the Louisiana Purchase, Article 3 of the Louisiana Purchase said that they're citizens. If you look at the treaty in 1916 on Florida, it said that they're going to be citizens. If you look at Alaska, and if you look at the Virgin Islands, all those treaties said they're going to be citizens. The only treaty that didn't say they were going to be citizens was the Spanish Cession Treaty. And so if you look at it objectively, whenever we've conferred citizenship on a territory that we've acquired from a foreign country that has foreign people in it, we've said if we're going to give them citizenship, then the Constitution applies. They're incorporated. Only in Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines did we say, even though because it doesn't say whether they're citizens or not, only in those cases did we not apply the Constitution. And then when we granted citizenship in 1917, Justice Taft comes running in from out of left field and says that the mere fact that we gave them citizenship doesn't mean the Constitution. So I would argue that the Balzac decision is actually in conflict with the Rasmussen decision, and for that matter, the Hawaii decision, and that Balzac is in fact, should in fact, if you're talking about overturning something, you should overturn Balzac, not Downs v. Bidwell.
Let me copy here, Steve.
The constitutional lawyer right there.
Exactly. And this is why Steve is with me, okay? Because as a lawyer and a law professor, sometimes we get lost in the weeds on those details. So you and I can have a great conversation on these discussions, but we lose everybody else along the way.
Let me ask you.
We need to bring you back, okay? So because there are portions of this argument that I like to talk about self-executing treaties in the United States, etc., without tipping too much about where we're going with moot court. But there's some very, very interesting real issues. We on Raw Talk and the Bar Association podcast are going to try to stay to the facts. You can come to your own opinion as to what, but the facts are facts, okay?
Facts.
And that's what we're
One.
going to try to elicit and take out. Go, Steve,
Facts
because I
is
know
something.
we pushed our time with Howard, but go ahead. And by the way,
That's
Howard,
okay, and that's okay, because
I
that's the
gotta try
beauty.
to invite you to be a judge on the panel, on the finals, because I think you would enjoy cross-examining the students on this.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm gonna be there. Let me tell you, Howard, this is a subject that is very personal to me. I'm gonna tell you why. You know who Luis Muñoz Marin is, right? Perfect. My grandfather was an advocate for Luis Muñoz Marin. My grandfather, I'm sorry, helped him in his campaign as he's trying to change what is now a commonwealth. Going hill by hill, house by house, down the river, up the mountains, knocking doors, okay? Because that's how it was done. I have pictures that my mother has, that my grandfather gave me before his passing, where when I opened the picture frame, there was 3 pictures. Not only the one that it was being shown, but 3 more, where you can see Luis Muñoz Marin and my grandfather's house, where I used to run behind the cows, as a little kid, where they, in the piece of yard that they sat down and talked to the people, and you can see the people with the cameras at that time, okay, taking photos. And there was a document in the floor, which I'm trying to get my uncle in, because he was present as a child there. I was not even born. And in this document, you can see Luis Muñoz Marin on his knees signing this document on the floor. What the document was, I don't remember. I'm going to look into that. But it means a lot to me because, for what I understand, he was able to create this commonwealth. But at the beginning, it was to help the Puerto Rican people because of the economy in Puerto Rico at the time and how poor this island was, which was considered at the time close to a third world countries. And if you look at pictures of Puerto Rico in the 20s, and you look at pictures of the New York City in the 20s, I'm a New Yorker like Tony, there's it's day and night, There's a place called El Fanguito, and this place still exists, and it's people living in a swamp. So the Estado Libre Asociado, which is a commonwealth, did bring hope, did create jobs, did bring programs to Puerto Rico to help the community. My grandfather had 3 chicken farms, and each one of those chicken farms, there was over 2,000 chickens that what they did was put eggs. He would get up with my aunts and my mother and my uncle, 4 o'clock in the morning, to clean these eggs, all 3 houses, okay, of all the eggs, classify them, put them in the back of the truck so he could take them over to the little convenience stores, mom and pop stores, which are basically gone nowadays. And he could sell these eggs, okay, to go work at Fort Buchanan. And then when he retired at Fort Buchanan, he became El Yunque Forest state officer. And all of this was done by the Estado Libre Asociado, which is the Commonwealth, which is what helped the economy of Puerto Rico at the time. That all of this, like you were saying, was created and not giving an open format to be able to give Puerto Rico the opportunity of being self-sufficient. And that's why the status is not issue. And that's why we today have what we have. which is what you've been saying, what Tony's been saying. Without Congress, without the Senate, we ain't going nowhere. There's no vote. There's no independence.
Yeah, and the thing about it is when you talk about that period, I don't blame the autonomists. They were faced with a situation where the president, the Congress, and the courts were not doing their job, and so they had to try to figure out, well, what do we do? And they came up with this doctrine of autonomy. I think what I would say about it historically, and I think we've been very good in this discussion. I really appreciate your all's accommodation, but we don't want to say too much about the UN process and spill the beans, so to speak. And so I think this discussion we've had sets the stage for them to then really focus on the UN in 1953 and what happened. And all of this is relevant because the autonomous movement in Puerto Rico the autonomists in Puerto Rico helped the United States do what they did in the UN in 53. In other words, the U.S. probably couldn't have done what they did if they hadn't had Puerto Ricans supporting it and going along with it. And so that's all very interesting. But I guess what I would say in response to your I listened very carefully to what you said, and I understand the meaning of your experience. What it comes down to for me is that the package that the autonomists were able to deliver for Puerto Rico is not the full package that you should get with your U.S. citizenship. They did their best. They innovated. I could argue with whether I think they were being completely I would argue whether or not there were elements of sort of propaganda associated with explaining it and whatnot, but I don't seek to discredit anybody. I seek to say the bottom line is it did not deliver on what U.S. citizenship promises. The promise of citizenship was not delivered by the autonomous. And I'll tell you something that I forget a lot, but I think this is, if any time to be remembered. I actually, in 1976, I had lunch in Santa Barbara, California, with Rexford Tugwell.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And I was a young law student, and he had read something that I'd written about civil rights, and it had been published in a very prestigious magazine called the Center magazine, which was published by the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. And Rex Tugwell was a senior, he was the emeritus head of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. And he, of course, had been the governor of Puerto Rico, appointed by FDR. And I believe that Rexford Tugwell had a relationship with Luis Munoz Marin. Yeah. And in fact, that Rexford Tugwell may have contributed, and I don't claim to be stating historical fact here, but I would speculate that Rexford Tugwell may have collaborated with Luis Munoz Marin on the development of the autonomy theory as an alternative to statehood or independence. And so anyway, I think that in my own life, I say, Howard's plan is never as good as God's plan. And I think somehow it was in God's plan for me to have met Rex Tugwell. And it's a very interesting fact that at that time, I did not focus on his relationship to Puerto Rico. I focused on his relationship to the issues, the civil rights issue. But I was aware of the fact that he had been governor down there. And he had been he was a socialist. He was, in fact, you could even go so far as to say he was a communist, but I don't say that in a red baiting, red scare way.
Wasn't he ex-military as well?
Well, no, he was the Secretary of Agriculture under the New Deal. And what happened to him is he was a hardcore socialist, and he published articles as the Secretary of Agriculture for FDR. He published articles that said that the private sector can never produce the wealth that's required to have justice, and so the government must own the means of production. I mean, he was way out there, and he got on the front of Time magazine, and he was a hardcore socialist. And I think Roosevelt said, you know, what are we going to do with this guy? You know, so they said, oh, I know, we'll send him to Puerto Rico. And they sent him down as governor to Puerto Rico. And he went down to Puerto Rico, and they kind of said, you can go do all your socialist experimentations, Mr. Tugwell. Go down to Puerto Rico and we'll let you do whatever you want. And he did. You know, there was a lot of government involvement in the energy sector and the utility sectors. I mean, I don't know the history of all of it, but the point is that whether it's a mixture of capitalism, socialism, you know, whatever it is, the package that was delivered it came to include the 936 tax deals and everything. In other words, you start trying to do a mixture of capitalism and state command economics, and you try to figure out how to solve poverty, and the bottom line is the real economic solution and the real political solution are always the same, and it's equality. You know, give people equality and let them compete and act in their own self-interest, and also act patriotically and with social consciousness. And we'll bring out the best. We'll produce, and that's what F.A. Hayek in Road to Serfdom, that's what he said. He said, the information you need to succeed and prosper and have prosperity doesn't exist in the government. That information only exists out among the people. And so the reason capitalism works and the reason democracy works is because the people have the wisdom and the people have the knowledge, and they will make choices that will produce the best outcome. The boats will rise, and you get the greatest good for the greatest number, not by having the government try to do that, but by having it come from the people. And frankly, ironically, bringing this full circle, that's what Thomas Jefferson was getting at in the preamble of the Declaration.
And with that, we're going to have to end the show. That was great. Thank you so much for your participation today, Howard. I really appreciate you taking the time out there in California and joining with us. And I do invite you to join us in the future. I'll get back to you, and perhaps we can discuss this in the future. Thank you so much.
I'm honored to have been there with you gentlemen today, and I'm looking forward to the moot court competition where we really focus on what happened in the U.S.
Thank you.
Howard, and it was an honor for me to meet you, at least like this. We'll meet in the future face to face. I've learned so much with you. Thank you so much for bringing so much information, so detailed, so eloquently explained, so I could understand it, you know? Yeah. So it means a lot to me. And I'm pretty sure we'll have you back again live in this show. I guarantee you that.
I'm available anytime.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is it. Wow, what a great interview. What a great interview. I also saw Monica.
That guy's an expert, okay?
Yes, he is. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Right,
how eloquently. I saw Monica on the box.
Okay.
And it said Monica, and then she left. So we need to bring Monica. Maybe we can do a little intro for Monica tomorrow before we start the show.
Okay.
If she's available. That way, people know who's behind closed doors taking care of us. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, we want to appreciate you and thank you for everything and for being here and for allowing us to stay in your homes, in your office, in your job, on your phone, because nowadays you can see this on the phone, and hopefully, come back tomorrow because we'll be here at 10 o'clock in the morning again with Divine Justice. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great day. God bless.
End stream, right?